Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to today's webinar. Riverkeeper partnered with the Chesapeake Bay Trust and their social marketing and behavior change expert, Kacey Wetzel, for today's presentation on how to develop effective behavior change programs for social marketing. To start, we just have a few housekeeping things. So you all should be in mute, and if you're not, please stay in mute or stay quiet for the duration of the webinar. Kacey's going to go through her entire presentation, but if you have questions that come up throughout the course of the slides, please type them into the chat box. I've already entered a message into it, which you all should be able to see, thanking you for tuning in. So I'm going to be collecting the list of questions during the broadcast. So feel free to enter them right in the chat box, and I'll shoot those over to Kacey at the end. Otherwise, thank you all for tuning in on behalf of Riverkeeper and the Chesapeake Bay Trust. We're thrilled to have you, and I'll turn it over to Kacey.
Hi all, my name is Kacey. I am Director of Outreach and Education at the Chesapeake Bay Trust, which is a grant-making entity based in Annapolis, Maryland. We have a lot of ground to cover in 45 minutes to ensure that we have time for questions at the end, so I'm going to jump right in. But before we get started, I wanted to say thanks to Jen for coordinating this webinar and for doing a survey in advance that told me what you all were very interested in. The results of that survey indicated that the bulk of you were interested in hearing information around conservation landscaping case studies and litter case studies. So I have taken two previous presentations I've done on those types of case studies, and I've smashed them together here. So you will see an inconsistency in the background because one of these was a converted Prezi and one was a PowerPoint, but I think it should still get the job done. So if anyone notices an inconsistency in the background, that's because these are two presentations that have been smashed together. So let's get started. So let's see. How do I? Give me, I'm going to have to. There we go. All right. So I've done a lot of presentations with a lot of different folks over the years on this front. I've worked with Nancy Lee, who's a pretty incredible social marketer based out of Washington State. And one of the case studies I'll be showing you today is a case study that she developed out there. I've also trained under Douglas Mackenzie Moore, another really great social marketer, and some of the content of this webinar is from him as well. So I'd like to start all of my presentations with this quote: while increasing knowledge or concern about the environment are worthy goals, studies have shown that being knowledgeable or concerned about environmental issues does not necessarily lead to action. That is probably one of the basic tenets of social marketing, right? That we all know the things that we should be doing. We should be eating well, we should be exercising. There's even doctors that know all the reasons why they shouldn't smoke because they would get cancer, but they smoke anyway. So what's missing, right? The idea that we could educate people to the point that they would change their behavior is a false premise. We have to give them more than knowledge in order to influence their behavior. So a lot of behavior change campaigns, I put that in air quotes, are information intensive and often unsuccessful. So not everyone does what they know is important for the environment or is best for them. So this graphic quickly shows that a lot of people provide a lot of information at folks. They think that the higher the reach, so TV, media, billboards, radio, the better the chance they'll have of influencing behavior. But that's also false. We know that, yeah, you'll reach more folks, but the likelihood of influencing behavior through those strategies is really very low. The more closely you move along the continuum towards one-on-one personal contact, the more likely you are to actually influence behavior. Just really quickly, here's an example of that. So there was a case study that was done. It was for a community. They prepared a water use handbook. This handbook cost $50,000 to produce and distribute. And half of this community that was the target audience received the handbook and the other half did not. And each household was individually water metered because they were trying to influence water use. they were able to then look at whether or not this really costly handbook had any sort of impact on the individuals that received it. After evaluating if there was a difference between the folks that received it and the folks that did not, there was zero difference. So $50,000 spent on a really expensive handbook had zero difference for the folks that received it versus the folks that didn't. So we're currently underestimating the difficulty of changing behavior. We're underestimating the time it takes to change behavior. We're using ineffective models pretty often. We're creating programs that lack evaluations, and we're measuring outputs instead of outcomes. I could spend an entire day just talking about case studies that are not designed to actually influence behavior, but that was just one, so we'll move forward. So a lot of you may have seen a version of this. This is called the diffusions of innovations curve, and I'm sorry this graphic looks odd, but the conversion from Prezi made it look a little bit weird. So you guys may be familiar with the terms innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, laggards. In social marketing, a few folks use this graph to kind of break it up into three categories. The show me's, which are often the 16% on the front end, innovators and early adopters. The laggards, who are considered the 16% on the back end, they call them the make me's, and they need regulations and legal interventions to obviously influence them, because usually they're actually opposed to action. Whereas if we jump back to the front of the scale, early adopters and innovators, that early 16%, all they usually need is information education to do something. So there is up to 16% of any given population that could be influenced by information or education. But the bulk of the population, some 68%, usually lives in this middle yellow category, which we call the help me group. And this is what we're missing right now. So most campaigns that we're creating in the environmental space are either to provide information and education, which could influence a maximum of 16% of people on the front end of the curve, or we're pursuing advocacy and legislation change. So we're working on the make me's on the back end, that back 16% that need to be made to do something. But we're oftentimes not designing programs to hit the middle group, which is the largest group, the help me group. And that's where social marketing lives. So what is social marketing? Who uses it? Social marketers, folks that are trying to influence behavior for the good of society. We are having lots of definitions of social marketing in the world at this point in time. The International Social Marketing Association has recently redefined it. This is an older statement, but very similar, which says that social marketing is a process that applies marketing principles and techniques to influence target audiences' behaviors that benefit society as well as the target audience. And this benefit to society is what distinguishes social marketing from traditional marketing practices used by corporations. So preventing injuries, improving health, protecting the environment, those are things that social marketing really focuses on. These are just some examples of the communication or the kind of forward-facing components of some pretty successful social marketing campaigns based in a lot of audience research. So these are the 10 steps of social marketing. And I'm just going to pause here to let folks look at this slide. I usually revisit it a lot. In this case, I was trying to kind of shorten our PowerPoint so we can stay under our 45 minutes. These are the 10 major steps in the social marketing process. And I'm going to walk you through each of them. So it's not the last time you'll see these terms, but if you just need 30 seconds to quickly jot these down, I'll let you take a second to do so. And then we're going to move into background, purpose, and focus, the first step. Like I said, we'll be grounding these steps in 1 or 2 case studies that are of interest to you. Okay. So step 1, background, purpose, and focus. So what's the background? It is what led to develop this plan. What's causing you to move in this direction? The purpose, what's the potential impact of a successful campaign on your issue? And your focus, what approach will you use to contribute to the plan's purpose? So in our world, oftentimes the purpose is to improve water quality. But you might have a very different focus depending on the type of nutrient or sediment or pollution that's loading into your sub-watershed. So you may take a different focus depending on the sub-watershed you're working in and what you know about the impairments are to that watershed. So when you're selecting a focus, you really want to consider impact, probability, and penetration rate. So what is the impact of focusing on car washing versus pet waste? What's the likelihood that your audience would adopt this particular behavior? And what's the current penetration rate of that behavior? Penetration rate means the current level of adoption of a behavior. So for example, where this becomes really important is we've been approached in the past by groups saying, we would really like to influence fertilizer use. We want to reduce fertilizer use in a particular community. And then folks come back to us months later and say, well, it turns out even though we really decided to go all in on this fertilizer campaign, no one in this community is actually fertilizing. That's the importance of penetration rate. You have to be aware of and able to quantify what the current adoption rate of a particular behavior is, because maybe you don't need to be focusing on that and prioritizing that above other focuses, other behaviors that might influence water quality. And the audience is already somewhat engaged, but not fully engaged. Okay, so we're going to start with a case example. This is a conservation landscaping campaign that happened on Virginia's Eastern Shore, done by Virginia Coastal Zone Management, also a 2009 case study. The other case study I'll be showing you from Washington State is 2009 too. So the background, loss of native vegetation on shores, and there's been a really negative impact on wildlife habitat and water quality. The purpose is to increase natural habitats for migratory birds and butterflies. And the focus they chose was native planting. So here's another case study, a litter focus. So the background, there was 16 million pounds of litter accumulated on state roadways each year. 4 million spent each year to pick up for only 25% of the population, which is littering. The purpose they chose was to reduce litter, obviously, and the focus, they decided to focus on roadways where they had an exorbitant amount of litter pickup occurring. All right, so those are examples of background, purpose, and focus. We're going to move to step 2 next, the situation analysis. So this is a SWOT, and most of you are probably very familiar with SWOT, so I won't spend a ton of time on this, but SWOTs are strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Strengths and weaknesses are internal assessments, and opportunities and threats are external assessments. So with the Washington State Litter Campaign, this is a lot to take in, but there was examples from each category after they conducted their SWOT. An example of a strength was that litterers are typically 75% male and often teens to early 20s. This is consistent through Keep America Beautiful's research across decades. Litterers are most often male, most often between the ages of 14 and 35. Examples of weaknesses to minimize, just picking one, there's a lack of enforcement, so they needed to focus on that as part of their campaign. Example of an opportunity that they decided to take advantage of. So reporting provides a good citizen opportunity, so they learned through some of their formative research that citizens were interested in reporting, non-litterers were interested in reporting litterers. And finally, an example of a threat that they identified through their SWOT analysis. Litterers are not motivated by environmental concerns, and a number of the groups that were part of this campaign were environmental groups. Okay, step 3, target audience. A set of buyers, oftentimes we use the term buyers in marketing, but you can transpose that word, sharing common characteristics that an organization decides to serve. So when you're talking about a target audience, you're not usually talking about the general population. This is where I see a lot of people get stuck. They're saying, we want to influence everybody, but that's not a good approach. And actually, it sets yourself up for failure. You really need to gain an understanding of who it is that you're trying to influence and serve. So you need to segment your audience, and there's lots of different ways to consider segmentation. I could do an entire training just on this, but you can think about size, demographics, their values, lifestyle, geographics, behaviors, readiness, and so forth. In the case of our native plant example, they did a breakout of their target audience through the upstream, midstream, and downstream approach. This is actually a pretty funny social marketing term. Given our world focused on water quality, they actually use the terms upstream, midstream, and downstream. It has nothing to do with the environmental world. It's just a coincidence. But whenever they talk about segmenting population upstream, they're talking about policymakers. And when they're segmenting a target audience in the midstream, they're usually talking about influencers. In this case, their midstream target audience was garden centers and nurseries who would influence their downstream audience. And their downstream audience were homeowners on the Eastern Shore, engaged in landscaping their property, and they're interested in protecting the environment. Through this group's formative research, they identified that these were very high probability folks that would adopt native planting behavior. In the case of our litter example, they had two major audiences for the campaign, those who litter, so 25% of the population, and then those who don't. So their segments were motorists or passengers who litter and drivers of pickup trucks that don't properly secure their loads, again, tending to be males 18 to 34. I'm sorry for any males on the phone. I don't want to seem like I'm driving this home too much. But attitudinal segmentation, targeting litterers, so most ready to change folks, and folks who are kind of thought as inconvenient, folks who are ignorant, and then versus folks who are willfully arrogant about it. So those were some of the folks that they identified in their formative research, that there was an attitudinal segmentation, that they could break up their messaging and their approach based on folks that fell into these categories from an attitudinal perspective. Their campaign message is also aimed at those drivers and passengers who don't litter, again, using them as a midstream messenger. Okay, we're going to move to step 4 now. So you have to determine your specific behavior objective and goals. So you may have thought at this point, well, I know what it is now, right? We're getting people to plant native plants and we're getting people to stop littering. But actually littering, it's a big world and there's all different types of littering that occurs, right? And there's all different types of native plants, right? So we have to be really specific with our target audiences. What do we want them to achieve? How do we get them there? So you guys have hopefully heard of the SMART objectives: SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. That works here, right? And when you're talking about specific and behavior change, it's pretty important. You want to pick a behavior that's non-divisible and end state. So you don't want to say plant a tree. You want to say plant a specific type of native tree, one of these 3, during the fall. Here's where you can get them, right? Just as an example. So here's some other examples. You can reroute your downspout to a rain garden. You can plant a native plant on waterfront shores. That's actually not even specific enough, I would say, but contain and cover manure piles, fence farm animals, fix vehicle oil leaks. These are much more specific behavioral asks. You want to avoid being too general, and you want to get folks to the end state. The end state essentially says, okay, you're not getting people to try and purchase a tree, you want them to plant it. You're not getting people to try to purchase a rain barrel, you want them to install it and maintain it, right? In our litter behavior objective, they had a short-term objective to create awareness that littering can lead to significant fines and that a toll number is available to report littering. They had a longer-term objective to make litterers believe their littering will be noticed and they could be caught. And their behavior objective, and this is the one that was paramount, was to influence litterers to dispose of litter properly, secure pickup truckloads, and clean out the back of trucks before driving. So they had 3 different behaviors they picked, which is why their behavior change campaign was spanned over the course of a decade. Step 5, identify barriers and benefits. This is the essence of social marketing, is trying to gain insight into your target audience once you've identified them. So you're trying to understand in social marketing what we call barriers and benefits to a behavior. What does your audience perceive as a barrier to doing the behavior? What do they perceive as a benefit to doing the behavior? Oftentimes, this can come across as whining when you do formative research through focus groups, survey work, intercept surveys, interviews. You do want them to whine, and you want them to listen, and then you want to listen without interjecting about what it is that they find difficult or beneficial to a particular behavior. So their perceptions can be real or perceived. It doesn't matter to you. Both of those are beneficial to your campaign. And these are some of the things that you're trying to gain insight into. So in the case of our native plant case study, some of the barriers they identified were that they don't know what plants are native, they don't understand what plants have to do with animals or water quality, their target audience lacked availability of native plants, they felt that natives might be scraggly and weedy and not attractive, and that garden centers were not currently helpful. And that's what they learned through a series of focus groups and then a subsequent survey that quantified whether or not those focus groups were representative of their larger target audience. So benefits are what your audience wants or needs that the behavior could provide. So you can think of these as intrinsic and extrinsic. Oftentimes intrinsic, it means that folks are looking for belonging, pride, looking good, those sorts of things that people might say or express as something that would make them feel good from an internal perspective. And extrinsic, oftentimes that's something outside of themselves they still see as a benefit, saving time, saving money. Those are frequent responses to an extrinsic benefit. I will say extrinsic benefits are oftentimes more commonly expressed than intrinsic benefits. If you're doing certain types of formative research, you have to be really skilled to bring out intrinsic benefits that are perceived by your target audience. Okay, in the case of our native plant case study, benefits that they identified were that they're easier to maintain, increased property value, and that they looked beautiful when shown the right photos. In the case of our litter case example, after their formative research, they did a review of past efforts, they did some field research and sampling of litter, they did focus groups with admitted litterers from high school and college, which was in their target population. And then they did a telephone survey of the general population. Again, this was a much larger campaign. They had a lot more resources because it was supported by the state. So a majority of the folks that they surveyed, 85% indicated that they would call an 800 number to report littering. These were the non-litterers that they were investigating. So really high response saying that they would love to be able to report litterers. So it became very evident that the state wanted to support costs. Sonoma County in particular was the one that led this off, that would allow folks to report litterers. Their barrier and benefit research showed, so they asked what would prevent litter, and there was a belief, litterers expressed that there was a belief that if they would get caught and they knew that there was fines that would actually come back to them, having gotten caught, that would prevent them from littering. But essentially, they also knew that they wouldn't get caught, or they often wouldn't be fined, and so therefore they felt they could litter. So it became evident through the outcomes of their research of the litterers that they had to find a way to make folks feel caught and to understand the fines more specifically, among other things. Okay, step 6 of social marketing is called the positioning statement. And this is usually the template for your positioning statement. We want target audience X to see desired behavior X as blankety blank, right? Seems simple, but this is a statement that's important because it ends up being a guiding statement for your entire campaign internally. This statement is not a statement that you would put on a message that would go to your target audience. This is for everyone on your team working on the campaign to remember that this is your goal and keep your eyes focused on the same goal. It's designed based on the outcomes of your formative research of your audience. So in the case of our native plant case study, their positioning statement was, we want Eastern Shore property owners to see planting native plants on their properties as a beautiful option, one that enhances habitat for wildlife as well as property value. I didn't pull in the positioning statement for the Washington State litter case study, but if anyone's really interested in seeing it, I can send it to you all later. Okay, so now we're moving into the other kind of bulky part of social marketing. And again, there's a lot to dig into here. We're doing a very light overview today. But the 4 Ps, this is really traditional marketing practice. So this isn't original to social marketing, this is original to marketing, which goes back to the early 50s. And product, price, place, and promotion are the 4 Ps. And you use these 4 Ps to think about ways that you can actually influence behavior and address, provide benefits and kind of overcome barriers that you heard through your formative research. Sometimes you're not going to have one of the P's, but it's really important that you think of all four, because there's a ton of body of research that says that when you actually address all four of these dimensions, that you're way more likely to influence behavior. Okay, so in our native plant case study, their product, which is goods and services, so anything that can be offered to a market to satisfy a want or need. They had their core product, which, I should take a step back and say, we shouldn't dig into this too much, but in social marketing, there's three types of products that folks consider. There's the core product, the actual product, and the augmented product. I don't push this too much, but it is a different way of thinking about the types of products you can provide. So your core product is the major perceived benefit. This is the thing that your positioning statement often highlights. Your actual product is any goods or services that you're actually offering to them. They're usually physically, much more tangible. And then the augmented product is the additional product elements to assist in performing the behavior. So if, for instance, you were considering the native plant case study, they had augmented product tags to make it easier in native plant nurseries to identify which plants were native. That was their augmented product. Obviously, the actual product was the native plants themselves and the services they provided. So price. So oftentimes with price, you can think of things in a bunch of different buckets. Monetary, which is goods or services. Non-monetary, which is time and effort. Psychological or physical discomfort. So there's monetary and non-monetary incentives for participating in a particular behavior. And it's good to think about whether or not your campaign can employ either monetary or non-monetary incentives. Or disincentives for that matter, making it more difficult to do the competing behavior, right? In the case of our case study, their monetary incentive was free technical assistance in identifying natives, and their non-monetary incentives were recognition pins for community leaders and messages stressing potential for increased property value. Placement is where you think you can make the behavior most convenient and where you think they would be best served by your product, service, and messages. So where are they going to perform the desired behavior? You have to think about where will they be, how close in time and space can you be to where they'll perform the desired behavior, where they're going to acquire related goods. So, convenience is pretty key when you're thinking about place. In the case of our case study here, local gardens and nursery centers increased accessibility and services, and they obviously put a lot of their campaign messaging at all of the local nurseries. Place is not the same as a communication channel, though. Folks often get this confused with communication channels. Promotion is where you talk about communication channels. Promotion is persuasive communications that are designed and delivered to inspire your audience to action. In our native plant case study, they developed a logo book that they used to train all of the folks at nurseries to understand natives and then be helpful to their target audience. You want to, when you're thinking about promotion, think about who are your key messengers. What are the messages that will have the greatest impact on your audience? What should your creative strategy be? And then what should be your prime communication channels? I'll say this, most folks focus on promotion because that's the thing that they most like to do and they're most used to doing, but that's information intensive, traditional awareness raising work. So the reason that promotion is the last of the 4 Ps is because people like to jump to it. So if you're forced to go through all of them, then you get to this last, which is great because folks always want to jump to this and do this kind of fun part first. So in the case of our litter case study, their product was a toll-free hotline and website, letters that they actually sent to litterers that were signed by the government based on the litter hotline calls. They would receive hotline calls and then they'd send letters to the litterers based on their license plate tag, letting them know that if a police officer had caught them, they would have been fined. The price was fines, obviously. The letters would dictate what the fines would have been if they'd been caught. The hotline and the website were free, though. And their placement strategy is that they had roadway signs with the 800 number so you could report litterers. They had a piggyback strategy for messages on driver's ed manuals because, again, their target audience was younger males. And then they had window decals, bumper stickers, and reminders on the roads so that folks could remember that this program was an ongoing program. This is some of the kind of forward-facing material from the Washington litter campaign. In their promotional strategies, they featured people who had been caught, again, trying to make people feel like that was a much realer risk, and then publicizing community service penalties for littering so folks would understand what the outcomes of being caught were. So behavior change strategies, I do an entire other presentation just on this, but these are some of the strategies that you can employ in order to affect behavior change, and you want to integrate these strategies into your campaign. Behavior change strategies, you can use commitment statements, extrinsic rewards, feedback, how-to skills, positive emotional states, prompts, things that serve as a reminder, trying to employ social norms, making people think that this is common, doing strategic storytelling. Again, any one of these things I could do an entire training on, but these are things to think about and learn about more and how to incorporate these things into your behavior change campaign. And if anyone has any questions about these types of behavior change tools, I'm happy to provide more information. The trust actually has a document on each one of these that summarizes the kind of strategies for employing these in your campaign. Stories, this is just one example. So the benefits of using stories, people can connect with narratives and connect kind of personal experiences. The challenge of employing stories is that you really need to know your audience because the story really needs to resonate with them. And then, aspects of interesting stories, you really want problem solving, characterization, concreteness, and imagery need to be used. I typically show a video here, but I don't think that we have the time for it. So step 8, the evaluation plan. So determining a plan for monitoring and evaluation and answering the question. So this seems fairly straightforward, but there are a lot of dimensions to evaluation. So why are you doing this evaluation? What will you measure and report? How will you measure it? When will you measure it? And how much will it cost? These things all matter when you're designing your evaluation plan for your behavior change campaign. So thinking about the answer to each one of these questions is important. So what are options for what you can measure and report? A lot of us, again, I'm sure are very familiar with these terms, but you can measure inputs, which are resources allocated to the campaign or program effort. Oftentimes money and staff time are frequent in this category. You can measure outputs, so activities conducted to influence the desired behavior, for example, events, websites, materials, services, right? You can measure outcomes, so numbers of behaviors influenced. You can measure impact, so for example, whether or not the behavior adoption improved water quality. And this is difficult to do, and one that I just want to kind of add a little asterisk here. In behavior change work, people do not often measure impact unless you can be sure that you can isolate your intervention's influence into that. So for instance, if you're working in a sub-watershed and the behavior that you're trying to influence is just one particular source, for instance, say you're trying to influence a horse farm operators in a particular sub-watershed to behave differently around how they are, keeping their horse manure covered, or if they are trying to dispose of it in a particular way to keep it from flowing into our waterways, you have to be sure that that particular bacteria is what you're measuring for, because there might be a lot of other bacteria that's flowing into your waterway. And when you do an impact measurement, you might not see a significant change if you have other types of contributions of E. coli being contributed to the waterway, just as an example. And then finally, there's return on investment. This is the most time-intensive type of evaluation, but it's also the most influential, I think. So economic value of changes in behavior and the calculated rate of return on the spending associated with the effort. So if you can take all of the costs that it kind of in your larger budget, look at all the costs and inputs going into changing a behavior and then calculate how many behaviors have you changed, you can actually figure out what was the cost to change a singular behavior. And you could track that over time to see if you're bringing down the cost of changing a singular behavior, which you often see over time in a longer behavior change campaign design. So ideally, in evaluation, you're considering how much did it cost to influence the behavior, what is the value of that changed behavior, and then what is the rate of return on investment. So that can take a lot to do, but there's lots of resources to help you in designing an ROI to determine whether or not you're actually bringing down those costs over time. Here's an example of a pet waste campaign that did that. I usually do like a whole background on this, but I'll just jump to their evaluation. So this was between 2001 and 2009. You can see that they were distributing something called mutt mitts. And they increased the number that they were distributing periodically throughout these years. They were also able to quantify the number of pounds of pet waste collected and disposed of properly at 0.5 pounds per bag on average. So you can see that over time, the pounds of pet waste collected also increased. Their annual program budget also increased. You're seeing an increase over the time, but the estimated cost per pound to collect and dispose of properly decreased over time, because you're seeing that the amount of pet waste that they collected over time increased so significantly that their costs actually per adoption of this behavior, per a pound of collection went down over time. So that's a great ROI right there. If anyone has any questions about that, happy to answer questions about that. In the case of our litter case study, the campaign measured a 24% reduction in their litter rate after campaign interventions were implemented. And they measured from the baseline litter accumulation. So remember, you have to take a baseline measurement before you start your interventions, or you won't really know what your change was after your intervention. So baseline measurements are really important. They saw a reduction from 8,000 to 6,000 tons of litter collected during their campaign. They also obviously tracked a number of other metrics, including calls to the litter hotline, which they noticed significantly increased in the summer months when folks were outside. They knew when to target their messaging too. So another type of evaluation. So step 9 and 10, you'd set a budget and find funding, and you'd write an implementation plan. I have templates for folks that are interested in this component. It's something that isn't really well dug into during a PowerPoint, but know that while these are not at all simple steps, they are fairly straightforward in that if any of you have ever written a grant proposal to a funder, oftentimes this is the process that you're going to be asked to go through. And so setting a budget and finding funding can take some time, but if you set a budget in advance, then it's helpful when pursuing what funding sources you might find useful. And then writing an implementation plan, again, there's templates for this that can be really useful when working on grant proposals. So there's lots of different issues that this can apply to, but one of the things that I wanted to pause and say is that we received a question in advance of this presentation about whether or not how social marketing has been applied in the EJ world, environmental justice world. And I'll say this, that is not a specific behavior, so I can't actually answer that question except to say this. There's a lot of different social science frameworks in the world. Social marketing is just one of them. There's community organizing, there's advocacy frameworks, there is community-based participatory research, which is also a behavior change framework, but is better applied in certain situations. So for me, social marketing is best applied when you have a very concrete and specific end state behavior that you can identify and would like to influence. There's principles embedded in social marketing that are absolutely useful in all different sectors of work. But it's not always your best framework. This is not a silver bullet framework for everything in the world, right? There's other social science frameworks that are sometimes better suited to certain goals, like fundraising, for instance. So that's the end of my slideshow. I think I finished 4 minutes ahead of schedule, so we have a couple more minutes for questions. If folks are, I think, Jen, you're now going to send me an email with a Google Doc, right?
I just sent some of the list of questions over in an email, and I have a delay on my email, so it might take a minute to get there, but there's 5, and I can read you the first one. How was the research done to ID the attitudinal differences among your male litterers?
Say that one more time, sorry.
How was the research done to identify the attitudinal differences among your male litterers?
So that was focus group work and some intercept survey work, as far as I recall. So I want you all to remember that neither of these case studies were actually case studies that I funded. These are case studies that some of my partners worked on. So if you have really specific questions about one of these case studies, I may have to go back to them for more information. But if I recall correctly, that was done through a combination of focus groups and then intercept survey work. Okay, let's see here. I think I have the email. Okay, so the next question, are there common or recommended tools for finding information on audience segments besides census data? For example, where could you find demographic information on who tends to litter? So specific to the example, Keep America Beautiful is your best source of information on demographic information on people who tend to litter. However, the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, has an insane body of information on us, and they have been an incredibly useful organization to gain information on how you might consider segmenting your audience based on their data sets. So definitely check out the CDC. Okay, next question. Should benefits and barriers be assessed for each target audience? Yes, they should. Now here's the thing, you have to gain insight into your audience in some capacity. So right now, most of us have been designing programs for a long time with very little formal efforts to understand our audiences. So any attempt in this space is a useful attempt in this space. And so whether or not you're being really intentional around barriers and benefits, trying to better understand your audience is valuable. Would I deeply recommend that you try to understand what you think is preventing folks from doing what you'd like them to do and what they see as potentially valuable to their lives? Yes, I think that that can be incredibly important information when you seek to design your campaign. So yeah, I see that as a really kind of core component of any social science framework, really, is understanding your audience. And oftentimes in other social science frameworks, and even in social marketing now, it's kind of trending away from just understanding your audience and more towards concept testing things with your audience and working with a subset of your audience to actually design a program with them, for them, kind of thing, right? Okay, next question. I'd be very interested in behavior change documents, she mentioned. Okay, I'm glad you're interested. Can those also be distributed, please? Yes, I will make sure that Jen gets some of the resources that I have available so she can disseminate them to the folks on the call. Can the template please be distributed? I believe that you're referring to the template that I mentioned right at the end. We also have something called ChesapeakeBehaviorChange.org. It's an online planning tool for behavior change campaigns. And I'll send that link to Jen. It's easy to access. The system isn't perfect. The data in it is not robust at this point, but it has existing case studies in it. There's 2 other places where there's aggregated case studies. There's something called the Tools of Change website that my colleague Jay Kacey has running, and then Doug McKenzie Moore also has a case study database. And so there's 3 different case studies. Those 2 case studies are not planning tools. They're just white paper case studies, but also very useful. Can be sorted by sector. And then the behavior change case study database, ChesapeakeBehaviorChange.org, that we've created, you can sort case studies by behavior, and by target audience. And then you can also, and they're, again, water quality focused behaviors. And then you can, I think the most useful design of that tool is that it walks you through the core components of a social marketing campaign, and you can use it just as a planning tool and not choose to post your campaign and go live with it. Okay, I've received a couple other emails from Jen. It looks with like additional questions. So where can participants access the CBT behavior change strategies documents? So we have these linked on our website at www.cbtrust.org. I will also send them to Jen so she can hopefully make them available in some capacity to the folks that called in today. Let's see. And one more. So question reevaluation. You referenced that many campaigns often invest in misguided behavior change approaches and programs. Yeah, read the booklet. So your discussion of evaluation seems focused on traditional evaluation, formative and summative, that's right. But not much on incorporating developmental evaluation for making sure you develop a good campaign to begin with. And yes, that's a really good question. So interestingly, I think that I could do like a whole day on this, but I think folks in our community, and I don't want to generalize too much, really struggle with evaluation, generally speaking, with building in the time and the resources that they need in order to ensure that their campaign, incorporates developmental evaluation at the outset of the campaign. And I think in part that's because we're a culture of doers, right? We want to get things done and we want to jump in as quickly as possible. This is one of the kind of places where I see folks backslide the most, right? They backslide into a communications plan. They backslide into not considering evaluation from the outset of their work. And so one of the things I was just sort of briefly touching on is that social marketing is shifting into this kind of new world. So, in the 50s, social marketing, by the way, was created in the 70s, but was coined in the 70s. But in the 50s, when marketing was sort of kind of coming of age and the advertising world was coming of age, 40s and 50s, we saw a lot of folks thinking of the 4 Ps in terms of how to influence folks by researching them. So there was a lot of this sort of one-way mirror glass research, right? Focus groups where the research sort of ended there and that was it. And the campaign was then designed. Now we're seeing a shift in social marketing to be much more inclusive in its approach. So developmental evaluation is kind of considered in that process, and concept testing is embedded in the process. So you're engaging a subset of your audience in the process from the beginning. You're designing your entire process so that the folks that you're trying to serve are also part of your process and helping you to design something that will maximize the impact and adoption of the behavior over time, if that makes sense. And I can send you some research if you're interested on the importance of concept testing. There's a really great guy, Craig Lefebvre, who wrote a book called Social Marketing and Social Change, and he talks a lot about this. So, any more questions? Can you show the online case study database and offer a quick tour to show us what is there and how we might use it? Yes, I can do that. We do have a lot of questions here.
If you want, I can I can make sure to include a link to the database, and I've poked around in it before, and it seems really straightforward. So I can make sure to include that in the notes.
Okay. Yeah. But to the person that asked that, I'd be happy to talk to you if you want a quick tour of it. I can certainly do that for you another time. So let's see. Are these are all new? So okay. So one of the outreach, I guess I'm assuming strategies we're trying to promote is by getting different groups of a variety of ages, demographics, educational backgrounds, etc., to create messaging that they find compelling. Interesting. Is that a decent strategy given we have no marketing staff or budget. Yes, yes, it is. So I think I was kind of alluding to this earlier. You know, we work in a community of nonprofit folks, and so any attempts in this space and in this direction to gain insight into your audience are valuable. And by engaging subsegments of your audience, you know, ages, different demographics, to understand what messages they'd find compelling, yes, that's useful. However, remember that they may not be representative of your larger audience, so you might want to create some of those refine some of those messages, couple them with some behavioral change strategies, some imagery, kind of synthesize them into a concept board, and then actually test them with a subset of your target audience. So take it a little bit further than just letting them create the message. Do you have any recommendations for implementing this kind of framework internationally? So I sit on the Social Marketing Association of North America's board, and SMANA has a number of different resources on our website, as does ISMA, which is the International Social Marketing Association. And so I would encourage you to go to SMANA's website. If you're really interested, I'd really encourage you to become a member of SMANA. Lots of resources, webinars, and things that'll come at cost to you by becoming a member of SMANA. So there's a lot of resources out there in that space, and definitely internationally. I have some colleagues on the board for SMANA from Central America who would I think be happy to provide you information and resources about case studies that have been done internationally. There's also USAID. If you guys are familiar with USAID, they've been employing social marketing strategies, as has RARE, R-A-R-E. Both of these groups are employing social marketing kind of as a core strategy of their organization. Let's see, thank you, great presentation. Oh, you're welcome. Please do send along a copy of the slideshow, and please advise of good follow-up avenues for us to explore. Well, I just gave you a few, so hopefully those are useful. And if you're really interested in being more intentional about learning in this space, I'd encourage you to take some of Doug Mackenzie Moore's trainings. And if you're looking to actually pursue academic kind of avenues in this space, please shoot me an email. Hopefully Jen will provide you that. I can send you some universities and colleges that are providing social marketing courses now. Is social marketing just for individual behavior? What about orgs like local governments? Okay, so my response to that is this. Organizations are made up of people, and so are local governments. So you have to have a clear understanding of who you're trying to influence in those organizations and those local governments, because there's different groups of people in those orgs and govs. So the answer to your question is yes, social marketing can influence folks at at the organizational scale and at a local government scale, but you do have to get a sense of who you're trying to influence in those spaces and why. And again, I'm happy to answer follow-up questions there, but I always find it interesting when folks sort of try to distinguish between an organization or a local government or something like that, because I think there's people in those organizations, and we have to gain a better understanding of who to influence there and how to best influence them. Okay, have you had experience, or are you familiar with a situation where there are two groups working to create behavior change alongside each other, but not working well together? One group who is, I'm sorry, I'm going to read. Have you had experience, or are you familiar with a situation where there are two groups working to create behavior change alongside each other, but not working well together? Okay, one group who is mandated by an oversight agency, and one group that is community-based. I see. Are there suggestions you would have for the community group? Okay, yes is the answer. Absolutely, I've seen this. This is actually kind of a common situation because a lot of local governments and similar entities are, state agencies are mandated to influence certain behaviors, and then there's community groups and nonprofits that are also trying to influence similar behaviors. I mean, I need to know more about why you're not working well together to really help you here, but my my quick 2 cents here is that if you really can't work it out, you want to think about changing who you're trying to influence. Think about what are those midstream messengers where you can have a greater impact and shift your focus. So I don't think that we focus on midstream messengers enough in our work. Oftentimes we think, okay, who's going to do this behavior? Let's focus on them and just bombard them with really messaging, oftentimes not products and services. But there's so many case studies over the years that say, like, women take a lot of information from a lot of different sources. There's tons of case studies in the public health realm, so social marketing originated in the public health realm. Really, to study it, you mostly still have to study it in the public health sphere. And these case studies show that, you really have to understand who folks like to receive information from, who they trust. And for our purposes, I think we need to pay better attention to who our target audiences receive information from, who they trust, and target them, resource them, create train the trainer programs for those midstream groups. Zoom out, stop trying to step on the toes of this larger entity. Let them work at the lower level and you work at the higher level. Okay, I hope that answered that question. I have other thoughts though. Do you have material on the subject of curbing use of gas leaf blowers? No, I don't. But that doesn't mean that I don't have other. I think I have a mower, like a lawn mower campaign that you might find useful, but I don't have a campaign on curbing the use of gas leaf blowers. I'm sorry that I don't have that, but I do have a lawn mower take back case study somewhere. I don't know where I saved that. Working with the faith community on watershed stewardship, it seems that we are promoting the intrinsic benefit of their values being expressed through behavior change. I would agree with that. How and where do you see values fitting into this strategy? How and where do you see values fitting into this strategy? I have to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely clear on the final part of this, but you're right. I mean, if you're doing creation care work, then you're definitely employing the intrinsic benefits of their perceived value and in adopting environmentally responsible behaviors. I don't know that I can really answer this question fully because I just don't think I fully understand the question, but I really encourage, my email is kwetzel@cbtrust.org. There's a lot of you on this call, so I'm borderline regretting giving you my email, but I of course would like to answer this question fully. So please email me at kwetzel@cbtrust.org, and I'm happy to follow up with you. I just need a little bit more clarity on where do I see value in fitting into this strategy. I think so. If you're asking me about the social science framework specifically, there's so much to discuss there. So I think that's another question. But social marketing and community-based participatory research have been employed in houses of worship a number of times, some of which I funded, and I'm happy to give you examples. I think I only have 2 more minutes, so I think I might have done it. I think I might have gotten through all the questions. So
you did, Kacey. You did a great job.
Great. Well, I look forward to doing follow-up with anyone that has any questions, and I'm sorry that this was a kind of a really fast overview. I love talking about this stuff, and I'm happy to follow up with folks. You will have to forgive me if I'm not super prompt in my follow-up. This is a really busy time of year for me, but I will make time for you eventually, and I would love to chat with you all about your work, because this is really important work, and I love to see social science science frameworks integrated into environmentally responsible behavioral pursuits. So thank you, everyone.
Well, Kacey, from Riverkeeper and from all of our attendees today, thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise. And everyone on the webinar, I'm going to work with Kacey to get out a follow-up email to you all. So thank you guys all for tuning in, and hopefully we can all continue to learn from the Chesapeake Bay Trust and use the resources that Kacey mentioned on the call and that we're going to send around to influence behavior in the Hudson River Estuary and beyond. So thank you everyone for hopping on, and we look forward to hearing all the great new projects that are going to come about.
Great.
All right.